This might be the only YouTube video on this topic.
All right. Hello, guys. This is Christian Idealism, and today we're going to have a sort of panel discussion about hell and the Catholic, at least acceptable Catholic views of hell. Now, of course, hell is a very controversial topic, and unfortunately, Suan Stoner was going to join us to present his. He had a presentation he was going to give us, but he couldn't make it, so I apologize if you guys were looking forward to that. But we do have me, dry apologist, and then of course John Buck. He had to go do something real quick, but he'll be back, so don't worry about that. Each one of us has a presentation we're going to do today, and so yeah, I'll get started with my presentation, and then dry apology and get yours, and then once John does his, then after that we can have a panel discussion after that, discussing the different stuff on that. So with that in mind, let's get started. Let me see if I can share my screen. There we go. All right, so the first thing we need to understand, at least with hell, is how it connects to salvation and sin itself. So I think your view of hell is going to reflect largely your view of how salvation works and how sin works. I think both these things are intricately connected to each other. And I think both dry apologists and John Buck can agree with me on this. And this is pretty consistent with the Catholic tradition. And so whatever view of hell you hold to is going to reflect your views of salvation and sin and how, all that stuff works. So the first thing to understand when it comes to salvation is going to be God's nature, right? So if God is a perfect being, then God is an eternal act of love. And so one way you could sort of describe the Trinity or the love of God is you have the Father, which is the lover, the Son, which is the beloved, and then the Spirit would be either the love between the Father and the Son, or is the thing generated from the love between the Father and the Son. Either way, no matter how you cash it out, that's going to be the nature of God. And of course, God is diffusive of himself and therefore of being. So you get the Son and Spirit as necessarily generated from the Father. And of course, I would argue that the Trinity itself is a representation of marriage, which is husband, wife, and child based on our limited human perspective. So I'm not saying that God is literally, husband, child, or husband, wife, and child, but rather it's a representation of at least marriage and how we understand as humans sort of reflects God's nature, right? It reflects the Trinity. So when we have this sort of picture of God, it sort of helps to understand, okay, well, where does sin come in? Where does hell come into the picture? And of course, where does salvation come into the picture? So I would say that the nature of salvation is called a marriage model, and this is reflective of God's own nature. And the first thing to point out here is that God desires all to be saved, basically. And salvation is basically identical to marriage with God when you are communing with God, right? And then not being saved is identical to divorce from God, and I'll get more into that later. So, of course, marriage, as any marriage, involves a relationship that is similar to God's own nature, right? The marriage between God and Israel, in Mount Sinai, that was the first marriage that God had with the human race, or not the human race, but it was with Adam and Eve, and they broke it, and it got restored with Moses. We can get. I don't want to get too much into details here on that, but basically, what we need to understand is with this marriage model of salvation, we can see that Christ is represented as the bride of Israel. Israel, of course, being the unfaithful wife, means that the breaking of the marriage between God and Israel is when Christ dies, as death does his part, or when a marriage ends, it's typically because one of the members has died. Right. So the atonement in this case is the ending of the relationship between God and Israel, and is a way to fully break the marriage of Christ and Israel. And of course, the renewal of the marriage is going to be between Christ and the church. Right. And so when you understand this sort of perspective, when you understand that Christ is married to the church, right, then we can understand, okay, what role does the church play? So I would say for number one, if we view this marriage model as Christ and the church, we see that it accounts for the Eucharist being the body of Christ. So if the church is the bride of Christ, then Jesus gives his bride his body through the Eucharist, right? In a very, literal sense, right? It's not just, I'm not talking a symbolism view here. I'm literally talking the actual Catholic view on this, right? And then, of course, it accounts for baptism and how the Jews would practice marriage ceremonies at the time. And so both in Jewish and Greek cultures at that time, the immediate, so this is a quote from New Testament scholar Peter Williamson. In both Jewish and Greek cultures at that time, the immediate cosmic preparation of the bride included a bath with fragment oil so that she could be clean and as beautiful as possible. So baptism, Paul is saying, is the church's bridal bath that prepares her to be united with her bridegroom. So this sort of makes sense of baptism, makes sense of the Eucharist. And it also makes sense, I would say, of how there will be no marriage in heaven, or at least not marriage between humans, right? But rather there's going to be marriage, because there's going to be marriage between Christ and the church, right? Everyone in heaven will be married to God directly, right? And so because everyone's going to be married to God directly in heaven, then there is no need for human marriage, right? Right. And of course, we can get more into that with the discussion, but I just want to point that out here that at least on this marriage model, the reason why there is no human marriage in heaven is precisely for this reason, because everyone's already directly married to God, right? And again, this is just the nature of salvation. This is how salvation works on this model. Now, of course, what about sin? Well, sin is spiritual divorce. On the marriage model, sin is where we either damage our relationship with God or break it, right? And so it is when we refuse to cooperate with God's grace and love and decide to not cooperate with that grace, right? And then we sort of decide to prioritize some other good over and against God's love, basically, right? And so the reason why, of course, that sin can never enter heaven is because sin by its nature is the very thing that separates our will from God's will. So if sin is the very thing that breaks the relationship with God, then you can't have sin in a place where you're going to have a union with God, union between God and the church, right? So I think that sort of makes sense of, why sin, cannot exist in heaven. Now, of course, this gets into the questions about the intermediate state. What about, why is it that when we die, so to speak, why is there this immediate judgment, right? So I think one important aspect to understand here when it comes to this is we need to understand that God himself is divinely simple. And if God is divinely simple, then his act of love cannot be different from his act of mercy. And it also cannot be any different from his act of wrath, right? So of course, I'm going to go very briefly here, but basically in the Bible, we see how God is a spiritual fire, right? In the Abrahamic covenant, he's a fire. In the Mosaic covenant, he's a fire. In the Passover, during, the Holy Spirit is seen as a fire, right? So we see this idea of God being fire, basically, in Scripture. And of course, fire is judgment, but also fire is purification and fire is love, right? And of course, if you read Hebrews, say that God is a consuming fire. And so if God is fire, spiritual fire in this case, then the beatific vision, the fires of purgatory, and the fires of hell are all God himself, basically. And so a soul's experience of God's presence, right, when we die, we meet God, basically, will either be hell, purification, or the beatific vision, which is heaven, right? That's how they describe it, at least in the Catholic tradition, right? And so basically, when you meet God, your soul is going to either be in one of these three categories. Either it's going to be in a state of hell, a state of purification, or the beatific vision, right? And so our subjectivity, or our response to God's love, is going to basically determine which one of these states we're in, right? And so on the beatific vision, of course, we love God fully. We're in full cooperation with God. And so that's what we call heaven. On purgatory, we love God, but we still hold on to some sinful desires, right? And so this would be purgatory. And of course, there's a long process that goes over this. And then, of course, hell would be when we just reject God fully, right? But the point here is that we cannot escape God's love, basically. If God is love, we cannot escape it. And so these are really the only three actions we can do when we respond to God's love. And this sort of makes sense of at least the intermediate state, right? Now, important point here is that if God himself is the fires of hell, purgatory, and the beatific vision, and if on Catholicism God is divinely simple, because if God's love is identical to his mercy and his wrath, right, then it really just comes down to a soul's response to God's love, basically. And so again, the reason for the immediate judgment after death is because when we die, we return to the source of love for which we came, in this case, God. And so our conformity or lack of conformity to love, or God in this case, will determine the state of our souls, which is heaven, purgatory, or hell. So on this sort of model and this sort of idea, hell is not really a place that you go to. Rather, it's a state of the soul. It's an inner spiritual fire, right? And of course, purgatory is the same way. And then you could argue that could also, arguably, I would argue that even the beatific vision is the same sort of way in some different sense. But anyways, so I also want to point out here that this is a position that's actually supported by the mystics. So I can't pronounce. There's so many Pope Benedicts that I don't even know which one that is. But basically, you have a lot of mystics that have said that the fires of purgatory and hell are sort of inner spiritual fires. So it's not something that is imposed on the outside, right? It's something that sort of envelops from the inside, right? And so, again, the fires of purgatory in this case is going to be, at least the pains of purgatory, right, is going to be, we want to long for God and we want to be purified. And of course, it can take a very long process. But the point here is that as long as you desire to be one with God, then you will be, right? I don't want to get too much into details on purgatory because I know this conversation is on hell, but we can't talk about purgatory if you guys want to later. But basically, what does this mean? The nature of hell in light of God's goodness. Well, the first thing is that, as I mentioned before, if heaven or salvation is being saved is identical to marriage with God, then obviously the exact opposite would have to be divorce from God, right? And so that's what hell is, basically, right? So divorce from God is the result of sin when we reject God's love. And of course, the wrath of God in this case is the felt absence of God's love in a person's life when they turn towards sin, right? So again, we have to understand that on divine simplicity, if God's act of love is identical to his act of wrath and his act of mercy, then really the only thing that distinguishes between hell and heaven is going to be our response to God's love, basically. And on this sort of model, hell is the full rejection of God, right? So the only way that you can actually go to hell on this model is if you just completely reject God totally. Like, it's not just like, oh, well, I didn't know about God in one life, or I had this unwanted, sexual addiction or something like that. The point here is that really the only way you can go to hell on this model is if you just totally reject God fully, right? And of course, that's what sin does to us, right? Sin sort of, it tempts us to prefer something that's not God and then pursue that good, even though it's probably not the best thing for us, right? And so, of course, I would argue that those in hell lose the beatific vision, but of course, that doesn't imply infinite torture or suffering. In fact, a punishment does not entail any view about the nature of that punishment, right? And so we can get more into this later, but I would argue that hell would eventually become limbo, so we can get more into that later. But yeah, I mean, this is basically the view that I hold to, and I think that you could argue, like, you could be a hopeful universalist and say, well, no one's just going to reject God forever. Okay, that's a fine, you might be able to hold that view as a Catholic. But I think that if you're going to hold the divine simplicity, I actually think that you have to hold this kind of view anyways. So this whole idea that, like, God has, like, these changing emotions where, like, oh, he's angry at one moment or something. I just don't think that really fits well with Catholic doctrine. So yeah, anyways, this is the last slide I have. So if you guys want to have any comments or anything like that, you can. But yeah. Any questions before we go to the next presentation?
How would you square the possibility for post-mortem redemption with sort of the teachings and tradition of the Catholic Church? Because, like, I know it's not like I know there's Balthasar who has sort of talked about hopeful universalism, but at least as far as I'm aware, within Catholic tradition, the understanding is that upon death, the judgment is final, and it's not the case that that decision can be changed in any way. Like, it's not the case that if you're in heaven at some point that, like, maybe God is going to revoke his gift and send you back down to hell. And it's not the case that if you find yourself in hell that God's not going to, like, change his mind and, like, send you up to heaven or something like that. In contrast to the C.S. Lewis sort of view of, or at least, I don't know, he's at least toying with it in The Great Divorce.
So I do think that the punishment of hell is eternal, but it really depends on the nature of that punishment. So my current view is that it's probably most likely the loss of the beatific vision, but that doesn't necessarily imply that those that lose the beatific vision are therefore going to like have infinite torture or something. Like I think there's reasonable I kind of wish Suan Senna was here because this is sort of his view, where it's like hell basically just evolves into limbo, basically, eventually. And so in that sort of view,
you want to characterize limbo for the audience, just because mostly Protestants, they probably won't know what that is.
No, yeah. So limbo, I didn't go over it in the presentation because it's not really essential to my model. But basically, limbo is a place where you're like, it's still hell. It's still in hell, but it's not like infinite torture or something. Like it's not like these souls are like, you know, having unfulfilled desires or, you know, something like that. So limbo is actually not really a bad place. It's kind of like an earthly paradise, except you don't have the supernatural graces, so to speak. So I guess you could call it like, I don't know, like maybe limbo is like the highest you can get in terms of natural goods, but just not supernatural goods, basically. Right. So my sort of view is that hell might just evolve into limbo in that case, where basically people just get to their senses and decide, hey, like let's make this place better. Like why make it hell? You know, why make it really, really bad if it doesn't need to be? And there's this possibility that like even those in limbo, at least some of them will be worshiping God. They just won't, of course, they're not going to receive the beatific vision because that's what they were, you know, that's their punishment, so to speak. So that's their eternal punishment. But the punishment itself does not imply any sort of like infinite torture or something. So like this whole idea that hell is always going to involve like, you know, someone having, you know, fire and brimstone on them is just not gonna, I don't think that's gonna be the case. So yeah.
I see. Yeah.
So yeah, that yeah, so, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I don't know if Caleb has any questions for this view.
No, I think it makes sense. I think probably it'll be helpful for John and I to go, and then we can kind of compare overall, because I'll have some similar things to like what Kyle was saying, but a little bit different. So, Kyle, do you see my slideshow? Okay, great. Okay, so mine's just going to be brief. I just kind of wanted to go over a few church statements from the Catechism that I consider relevant, because the Catechism is kind of a a summary of current, church teaching, and the way the church has phrased things over the centuries has developed, although, I'd argue the core doctrines have stayed the same. So I just kind of want to highlight what those teachings are and then argue how there are different conceptions of hell that can be compatible with church teaching, kind of like what Kyle was arguing. So this won't be too long, but this is from the Catechism in Article 1033. So to die in mortal sin, and mortal sin would be like a serious sin, like, rejecting God altogether. And, that's a broad topic on its own, but a serious sin without repenting and accepting God's merciful love means remaining separated from God forever by our own free choice. So that was similar, I think, to what Kyle was talking about in terms of like the marital type relation with God. Now, this state of definitive self-exclusion from communion with God and the blessed is called hell. So hell is just a term for that exclusion from God at the time of death for somebody who has severed that relation through mortal sin. Then it goes on, the teaching of the church affirms the existence of hell and its eternity. Immediately after death, the souls of those who die in a state of mortal sin descend into hell, where they suffer the punishments of hell, eternal fire. Now, eternal fire is, put in quotes because that's a biblical term. I don't think that means that the fire is a literal, lake of fire. That it's just using the biblical terminology. And then it goes on again. The chief punishment of hell is eternal separation from God in whom alone man can possess the life and happiness for which he was created and for which he longs. So similar to what Kyle was saying, that, in the Catholic tradition, it's viewed as the beatific vision where one beholds God in all his glory, and that fulfills man, and somebody in hell is separated from that. So that's really all the Catechism says about the nature of hell and its punishment. There's really not a lot of specific details. So I think this position is compatible, or these statements are compatible with three different broad positions at least. And one would be eternal conscious torment, which is the typical traditional view, often associated as a traditional view, where individuals excluded from God's presence experience some kind of unpleasant experience, whether that's physical torture, some kind of psychological torment, but it would be for the rest of time, the rest of their existence. And then annihilationism would be the view that individuals excluded from God's presence. So annihilationists would still call that hell. They would just say that what that is an eventual ceasing to exist. So that person goes out of existence. Now, it is controversial whether Catholic teaching is compatible with annihilationism. I've argued that it is, but I don't see, at least it's not obviously excluded. It might be kind of heterodox, but it's not obviously excluded. But if one's not comfortable with either of those positions, I've argued for room for a middle ground position that I call semi-annihilationism, which is the view that individuals will continue to exist, in a resurrected state, or those in hell will continue to exist in the resurrected state, but they could lose their conscious awareness because they're not in communion with God. So they wouldn't be in some kind of conscious torment for all eternity, but they would continue to exist. And to me, that does seem like that is compatible with church teaching, and the statements that I read. Okay, so now, is hopeful universalism an option for Catholics? So I think it is. So just based on, nothing in the Catechism rules out hopeful universalism. So the idea that we can hope that everybody will be saved, even though we can't have certainty that everybody will be saved. So, the Catechism says that God predestines no one to hell. So it's not God's plan for anybody to go to hell, and that God desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So if God desires for everybody to be saved, he predestines nobody to hell, and it's man's free choice to accept or reject God. It seems like it's at least logically possible that everybody could accept God. God could give the graces enough for everybody to accept him. Even if one views that as unlikely, we can't rule it out for good. Now, can church teaching develop on hell, or really any doctrine for that matter? So I would say some core teachings cannot, a core teaching cannot be, or any teaching for that matter, cannot be done away with, but it can be developed. So for example, infants who die without baptism was a teaching that was developed. So around the, limbo, for example, has never been a dogma, but it was a theory that those infants who are not baptized wouldn't go to heaven to experience the beatific vision, but they go to limbo. Well, that's never been a dogma of the church. It's been a theory. And lately, the church has said that that's not a necessary theory to hold, though one could still have theoretical views about limbo, kind of what Kyle was talking about. So in this document, The Hope of Salvation for Infants Who Die Without Being Baptized, that was produced by the International Theological Commission, which is a committee under the Vatican or within the church hierarchy. So it says, when the question of infants who die without baptism was first taken up in the history of Christian thought, it's possible that the doctrinal nature of the question or its implications were not fully understood. Only when seen in light of the historic course of time until Vatican II does this specific question find its proper context within Catholic doctrine. So, there's an acknowledgement that Catholic doctrine can develop, and we can come to a greater understanding of God's justice and mercy. And even if voices in the past, so saints and theologians, maybe weren't as big on something like a non-eternal conscious torment view of hell or hopeful universalism, they weren't obviously ruled out. So it doesn't seem illegitimate that we can't say, well, maybe that's how it'll end up working out. Again, there's no clear condemnation from the church, and there can be development in terms of what gets emphasized. So I'm not going to take a dogmatic position one way or another because I don't know, but I do discourage, Catholics from being overly dogmatic. Maybe there are some positions, like maybe a Catholic can't affirm certain universalism because we can't know if an individual is going to be saved or not unless they're canonized by the church. But hopeful universalism and what I would argue more merciful views of the punishment of hell, I don't see why those would be excluded. So hopefully that makes sense, and that's the summary there.
Thanks, Caleb.
All right, John, do you have your presentation?
Yeah.
Or did you want to talk about?
I'll go ahead. I can do mine. And then we can just sort of discuss the virtues of each of them. All right, let me share screen. All right. Hell, what it is and why it is. So I'll be defending, I guess, what I don't know. I have like two models of hell that sort of like make sense to me, that seems to fit quite well with the tradition, or fairly well with the tradition. And I've realized that there's a kind of commonality between the two. And so I'll be defending this more vague notion of hell. And if I need to, I can go more into specific regarding like another form of this, but I call it like the inhibitory model of hell. So let's see. I think that at least starting off, we should try to like be as close to what has commonly been known about hell or considered about hell. And then if we need to, we can diverge from that. So the basics, I guess, what we know about hell is that, one, hell exists. Gehenna is a place or state where those who reject God are put, and we can quibble over whether God sends people to hell or people send themselves to hell, and whether it's a state of consciousness or if it's a literal place or something like that. Two, that hell is eternal, that those in hell cannot leave there and shall continue to exist there for eternity. I know this is probably the most controversial component of hell, the fact that it is infinite, that it never ends. Any other model of hell that will be more sympathetic, more people will be more sympathetic towards, is going to be one that eventually stops. But it does seem like within the tradition, the emphasis is that hell is symmetrical to heaven. So if heaven goes on for an infinite amount of time, then so will hell as well. Those in hell are conscious. We can know this specifically from Jesus' sort of parable about Lazarus or Eleazar and the rich man. And now it is a parable, so we don't have to take it like with full assumption that this is literally how it is. It could be that there's some sort of additional components that Jesus is sort of embellishing. But I think at least from the parables that are put about hell, there is this sort of an acknowledgement that the people are aware and that they are in hell. And then 4, to be in hell is worse than life. So I'm generally hell is understood to be tormentful or painful, things like that. And I think that that's a useful. So this is where my model is going to sort of be diverging somewhat from that, but it's still going to at least being retaining this sort of acknowledgement that objectively it is worse to be in hell than to be in heaven, for sure, or even to be in limbo achieving your natural goods, or even to be in the way that we are right now. Like, you don't want to go to hell, so whatever you can do in this life to prevent that, then you should do so. And then 5, that hell is justice. I think that some models of hell fail to consider that, like, it's fitting that the people in hell are in there due to the actions that they've committed, and not just like their mindset or something like that, but rather what they've done. And I don't know, this may be a short sight on my general model that I'll be presenting in just a second, but I think it can be still made sense of, even understanding hell as like justice being performed, and that hell is not empty, that men are capable of going to hell. Now, I know that like there's no certainty, there's no official teaching as to who is in hell by the Catholic Church, but it is sort of recognized that no, teaching that hell is empty does go against tradition. But at least within the Catholic Church. So like in Eastern Orthodox, I think that's not as bad, especially since like there's a acknowledgement that on resurrection or during those 3 days, Jesus was going down to empty hell, and so maybe he's doing that every year or something like that. Anyway, so this is the inhibitory model of hell. So my model is that upon death, those who have rejected God during their life will continue to exist in their present state, willing something other than God. So that's what I mean by rejected God, is to will something for their final end as something other than God. Now, it's not the case that even those that like are just think that God doesn't exist. That's not what it takes to reject God. Really, what it takes is to reject what God is. And if God is like the highest good, then they are rejecting God when they will for something that isn't the highest good that could be had for them. So in the cases of sin, when somebody like chooses to commit adultery or something like that, they're willing a lesser good than the higher good of remaining in a committed relationship with their spouse. Anyway, willing something other than God, and God will respect their rejection of him, but will prevent their decision from harming themselves or others any further. To do so, God must inhibit their faculties such that they can no longer sin. So this is where, like, specifically my model comes in, where it's trying to make sense of how is it that hell can be just, given that if people in hell are so depraved that they're inclined towards sin all the time, it would seem as though they're going to keep committing sin while they're in hell. And I think that's like Jerry Walls's view, that like the reason that hell might be eternal is because the people in hell, well, they just keep on sinning. But it seems to me that that would be almost like unjust for God to allow them to do so. Like we can imagine a warden at a prison where he just puts people in prison and then allows them to just like keep committing the acts that got them into prison upon each other, and it seems, or upon themselves or something like that. And it seems like that's not a very just warden of that prison. So here's where my I guess model of hell comes in, and saying that God, what God does when he puts somebody in hell, is he takes away their powers or their faculties such that they no longer are capable of sinning. But he's not like doing anything to change their will in a sort of like, that's a common objection to like universalism, is that God's like almost like fiddling with your will to make you like will the highest good, which some might see that as like an unconsensual act. But it's rather God is sort of taking away their powers and faculties. And I think we have some sort of reason to consider this as a real view, given that like strongly within the tradition it's been understood that sin darkens the intellect. We can sort of see that like when somebody is like committed themselves to sin over and over and over again, they're going to no longer see the sin as horrid as it was when they first did it, or they may be like, or as horrid as other people that aren't sort of committed to this sin might see it. So like somebody who let's carry on with someone who like commits adultery all the time, they come to think of it as like, oh, this isn't really that bad, it's just like I'm poly or something like that, when really like from those outside they can recognize, no, that you betrayed your wife's trust, and you're being disloyal in this. And so there's this sort of understanding that when we sin, we continue to like make it so that we no longer see the sin as bad. But so the way that I've sort of thought about this is that like when we go to hell, it's as if we are converted into a lesser being of some sort. So like rather than being a fully rational animal, such as we are with like a fully functioning intellect, I would think that like our sin has inhibited us so that we're only willing towards this particular less good, or least good, or it's not even least good, but a lesser good than the beatific vision. And so when we're in that state, we're sort of like fully drawn towards it, almost like an animal that is drawn towards the object of our sin. And so there is a sense in which like God is allowing us to become like non-rational in a sort of sense. All right. And then this is what sort of justifies the fact that hell is actually bad for somebody, because when you're in a state of hell, then you're no longer going to have these sorts of capacities that you would normally have during your life. Yeah. All right. So let me go back one if I can, actually. This is like my main model. And then I have a further model that basically goes down to, well, maybe if God's inhibiting these capacities, he may even go so far as to inhibit our ability to experience time passing, so that those in hell aren't experiencing the torment of their frustrated desires as time passing, but is rather just a single moment that is extruded across time, and God just sort of sustains them in existence. And then yeah, right. And then there's no longer this ever increasing number of days or moments for the damned. All right, so now I'll just sort of compare this or give some reasons against some of the other views of hell. So why not the traditionalist view? I think that we should really take into consideration our moral intuitions regarding this matter, given that, like, when we try to think of, like, okay, what would an all good, all loving God do? It doesn't seem like the traditional model of hell, which is typically sort of thrown out there of like eternal conscious torment, which is ever increasing across time. That just doesn't seem at all like what something that an all good God would do. In fact, people would like have intuitions the other way. And so that's at least some reason not to take that view. And then it would also seem like this is an argument that some annihilationists have given, is that it doesn't seem like on the traditionalist view that God's justice is ever met, given that, like, for every day that a person is in hell, they still have an infinite number of days that they need to meet or they need to undergo in order for God's justice to be met. But given that time will be infinite, there's never going to be a point in time in which all of their sentence has basically been fulfilled. And so it would seem as though God sort of provides a sentence for the damned, and then the damned are sort of left out of actually accomplishing that sentence or fulfilling it. And then I do think that the traditionalist view can be argued against from the development of doctrine, given that, like, we typically understand development of doctrine when the people at some point in time held to different views as we did, and then we've sort of developed on those views regarding, say, economics. Like, there was previously held that any sort of like gaining money for lending, or like gaining interest on lending money, is something that is off the table, it's a horrible sin. But like, through development of our understanding of economics, this is no longer recognized to be as harsh as a sin. Similarly, we could see that the sort of understandings of punishment through torture and things like that is no longer really an appropriate way of responding to it's no longer appropriate way of responding to enacting justice. So we should maybe move away from that sort of model of hell. All right. So why not the annihilationist view of hell? I think I sort of brought this up earlier. It does seem like within the tradition and within like the teaching, that there's a strong symmetry between the elect and the damned, where one is on the right, one is on the left. And it would seem as though if annihilationism is true, there's not really this symmetry any longer. And so that's at least something to take into consideration. I also think that, like, at least on the model I was sort of presenting, it's in a way good that the damned do remain in existence, since there are some things that they can do. They can achieve certain desires, I guess, maybe. And I don't know, if you're like a strong Thomist, you think that for anything that exists, it is good that it exists, given that for anything that exists, it desires to exist. And so, like, maybe if God were to annihilate creatures that wanted to exist, this would be God acting against their good and like doing something morally wrong. And so we wouldn't think that God would want to do that. And then also that annihilationism is sort of counter to tradition. It's very hard to sort of find that within the teachings of the church currently, or even the teachings historically. And so that's at least some reason to sort of counter it. And then why not universalism? I think that universalism is going to sort of go against our common intuitions regarding how a loving relationship is supposed to work, where you have both parties in a relationship willing to be in union with each other. But if you have one person willing the union and one person actively rejecting that union, it doesn't seem like this person that is willing the union to occur is like morally permitted of like changing the person so that they do will the union. It does seem like that's like going against their consent. Also, I think that like on universalism, there's not really an authority, or there's not really the power or appropriate authority placed upon the person regarding their own soul. Seems like people don't have the ability to choose where they end up, whether it's be with God in the beatific vision, or maybe in limbo or in hell. And so it seems like I don't know, it just takes away the autonomy, which I guess is similar to the first one, but it is kind of somewhat different. It's like this would be to say that like it's good that people have a certain autonomy over themselves. And then the last point is that I think that most universalists seem to think that like when people sin, they're like doing so out of ignorance or out of some sort of like innate desire that they have towards this bad thing. And like, sure, it's certainly the case that we will do things that are wrong, or without realizing just how bad the consequences of our actions are. And it's also going to be the case that we have concupiscence, and where we have a desire towards things that aren't actually good for us. But I don't think that all sin can be boiled down to that. And so I think that universalists will make the case that sin is just these two things, either ignorance or some sort of innate desire, and God being all good is going to enlighten the people so that they're no longer ignorant of the effects of sin, and will also take away the desires that they might have towards sin. But I think that like, no, sin is to will a lesser good, or to will a good that is contrary to some higher good. That's probably a more appropriate way to say that. And I think that people can will these things and can choose to will them as the final resting place for where they wish to spend eternity with. So yeah, these are my points. I don't know, the way that I sort of think about this inhibitory model is similar to like Aristotelian sort of virtue ethics, where you become what you practice. And so if somebody spends their life practicing sin, then that's the way that they're going to become in the afterlife. Yeah, and that's my case, I guess.
All right. So there's a lot to say on each of our models. Maybe we can start off with what we agree with, which is the nature. So where should we start off? So the eternality of hell. Now I know, Dry Apologist, I know you presented a sort of semi-annihilationist view, and I think that would actually be compatible with Catholicism, but not the traditional annihilationist view. Because I don't think that God would actually annihilate anyone from existence, right? I don't know. What do you? I mean, I don't think that's compatible with Catholicism, actually.
Yeah, I guess that would depend. I mean, it certainly goes against, like you're not going to find a lot of support in the view. I guess it just depends, because like annihilationists have like clever ways of arguing, like, well, the soul is immortal, but it's only immortal if God sustains it in existence, like type of thing. Like it's not, immortal by necessity. So it's like conditionally immortal, and hell just is annihilationism. So yeah, I mean, that's why I kind of like that semi-annihilationist view better, and also I agree there's kind of a moral concern with annihilationism, that God is destroying people, and I agree that that's at least a plausible moral concern. So yeah, I think like in a broad sense, annihilationism is like technically compatible, but yeah, I like the semi-annihilationist view better if one has that kind of leaning.
Mm-hmm. So I think there's a sort of similar like argument that can still be played out to the semi-annihilationists, where if it's bad for God to annihilate a soul from existence, maybe it would also be bad for God to like put them to sleep basically for the rest of existence. Because like if it's a good thing for a creature to exist, it might also be a good thing for a creature to be aware of its existence. And so for God to like put them
But
to
I
sleep.
think,
Yeah.
sure,
They'll,
I think I
they'll
get it.
lose
But
that good.
I
Yeah.
think that same objection could come back against your view, though, because like you could say, well, it's bad for God to, and it's like it could just be an intrinsicality that, like, if you're not in this kind of relation with God, these are just the essential ramifications. And it could be, while it might not be ideal, it could be the most ideal and merciful thing for God to do. You could also make that argument. So I'm not sure that it's obvious, but like with annihilationism, it's like it does seem conceivable that God could continue to keep that being in existence. I guess they could say, yeah, but it's the merciful thing, but it's like, okay, but if God could keep them in existence and give them some not torturesome existence, that does still seem better than just taking them out of existence, I think. So yeah, I think the annihilationists might have a tougher time around the objection than the semi-annihilationist or your model would on that.
Right, and maybe even like Kyle's model would also have it be a little bit more favored between yours or mine, because God would allow them to undergo their punishment and then eventually reach a point in which they can achieve like a lot of like general natural goods rather than the supernatural good of the beatific vision.
Yeah, because on my sort of model, the damned do get their eternal punishment, but the eternal punishment, it's a permanent, so it's still permanent, so it's a permanent mark on their soul, basically. But it doesn't stop them from achieving what's called natural goods, right? And that's where limbo comes in onto my picture, where basically once they've received, they've hit rock bottom, after they've received that permanent punishment, then after that, it's not that they won't be, it's not that the reason, I mean, it really depends on what you mean by salvation. If you mean by salvation by the beatific vision, I mean, at that case, I would argue, well, no, once you go to hell, you can't be saved in the sense that you can't get the beatific vision. But you could achieve something close to it, basically, is what I would argue.
Yeah, so I had a question about that. It almost seems kind of like immoral in a sense, because like if we were to imagine that like somebody undergoes their punishment, they see the error of their ways, they decide to try to make their life into a good thing, and then they eventually like come to know God and to love God and to worship God. It would seem weird for God to like not bring them up into union with him, because like that's something that God wills for the salvation of all. And so if there are these people in limbo that are willing to be in union with God, and then God just neglects to bring them up into union, then it seems like that would be kind of immoral for God to refrain from doing, or wait, to go, yeah, from refrain from doing. Yeah.
Well, it really depends, because I do think that they might still, I think it, because on my sort of view, the reason why they don't receive the beatific vision is just because they don't want to receive it. It's not that God can't give it to them, right? And this is sort of the view that Suan Sona he pointed out, how they'll realize the depths of their sin, right? So it's sort of like this restorative justice part, but then they realize that, okay, I accept my punishment, I won't receive the beatific vision, but at least I can still have these natural goods, basically, right? So that's, and so this does sort of line with the sort of restorationist view of justice, basically, where both, purgatory is a restorationist view of justice. There, of course, is, you love God, so God works through you to do better, so that you eventually receive a beatific vision. For hell, it's a little bit different. So for hell, instead of the person getting beautified, they sort of see the effects of their sin, and they accept they accept their punishment at the end of time. Basically, they accept the fact that they're not going to get the beatific vision, right? And so then the best they can basically do at that point is sort of this limbo state. I mean, eventually,
Right.
of course, I do think that hell, I think that there is going to be some suffering in hell. I just wouldn't argue that it's like eternal or something.
Right. And I guess they could be content in the fact that they're not going to achieve the beatific vision, similar to how we might think that angels, like even angels that do worship and love God and act in accordance with God's will, they aren't going, or at least as far as we know, aren't going to like achieve perfect union with God, given that like Christ didn't.
Yeah, there's a few analogies you can sort of think about this.
I'll just say real quick, I don't know
Right.
if I'd agree with that though, John. I think the angels my understanding is that they would achieve the beatific vision as well. They just
Well,
don't
wouldn't-
need Christ to die for them. But that's kind of a separate topic, though. So
okay.
maybe I don't want to
Yeah,
derail
maybe.
us. But go ahead.
So one view we can sort of view this at is, let's say, and this is just an analogy, right? So let's say there's a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and they try to work it out, and it just doesn't work. And then later in time, the girlfriend, right, in this case representing God, marries somebody else, right? And but then the person that's in the wedding, they're in the audience, but they're not themselves getting married, right?
Mhm.
So even though they rejected, let's say, the people in hell rejected God initially, they're still happy that others were able to enter into that marriage relationship, even if they themselves are not going to enter into that same marriage relationship. Because I think there needs to be a distinction made between marriage and like friendship. So I do think that I think that they could enter into some sort of friendship with God, in the sense of like, okay, I realize my sins and I'm going to achieve the natural goods, but I accept the fact that I'm not going to be married to God in that sort of stronger supernatural sense, basically, right? I hope
And
that
they
makes
wouldn't
sense.
and they wouldn't will to be married with God. They would just will to only be friends with him.
Yeah, they would, because they realize the depths of their sin, right? And so that's the effect of what hell does to somebody, basically, where they realize the depths of their sin, and the reason why they don't will to be married to God in that sort of strong sense is just because they realize the damage that they've done, and so they
Right.
don't themselves deserve that. So they they don't reject God's love, but they reject at least that sort of deep intimacy with God, right? Now, of course, that's very it's very speculative, right? And I've gone back and forth with Universalists on this point, and I kind of wish he ran Sona, because that's sort of his model as well. But yeah.
I guess my objection to it, I don't have a problem with it, like philosophically, but I guess an objection could be like, is that so? Like when looking at scripture and the tradition, like hell seems to be presented as kind of this horrifying state, or maybe I want to avoid saying that, but that there's, I don't know, is there strong support for the idea that hell is going to be like almost lessening in punishment over time, or is there just kind of like a permanent severity for anybody there? Maybe would be, in my mind, an objection that could be raised.
Well, I do think one acceptable view, at least within Catholicism, is that those that enter hell are not going to necessarily receive more of hell. Like, it's not like it's going to get worse over time. I mean, it might at first, but it's not like going to perpetually get worse for, infinite. We're talking like infinite time, basically, right? I don't think it's going to get perpetually worse. And I do think I would probably more agree with John Buck's sort of idea that maybe there's some sort of inhibitory state, like they can't sin, right? But they still have the will to sin, and so maybe in that sense they sort of they realize the depths of their sin and the damage that it does. Or maybe there's just one sense in which they sin so much that they just get burned out, basically, in hell. So I don't really, what I mean by burned out is like they just get sick of it. And so at that point, then they realize the damage that it's done, and so then they try to achieve the natural, maybe not a supernatural beatific vision, but maybe like some sort of natural goods that they can get, right?
It kind of makes sense, because like when we think about sin, like it's always achieving some sort of short-term good at the expense of the long-term. But like if we're going to be there for an infinite amount of time, it seems like these short-term goods are never going to be satisfying at all. Like, unless there were like a bunch more opportunities to sin, like you could get to sin further and further as you go in hell. But it seems, I don't know, that's why I think my sort of model makes more sense in that, like, God is actually inhibiting the damned from actually performing their sin any further.
Yeah, and I would argue the same thing, that basically, for heaven, of course, the people that go to heaven are going to get more and more heaven as time moves along. But for people in hell, that's not the same thing. It's not like you go to hell and you receive more and more of hell. Right. I think that there is I think there is a stopping point by which God sort of blocks you from sinning in the, not doesn't stop you necessarily from sinning, but rather he stops you from going deeper and deeper into it, basically.
Right.
So,
and I do also like how, I mean, traditionally speaking, limbo, even though it's just a speculation, it's not something that we gain from like faith at all. Traditionally, limbo has been seen as like the top circle of hell, and so like it is technically part of hell. And so if you're in one section of hell, it's not as much of a leap to say, okay, well, you just move to this section now over time, rather than the complete different of like going
that's
from
the thing
hell to
is
heaven or something like that.
The only thing that really Catholics have to hold to is that once you go to hell, you can't get out. But that doesn't say anything about limbo, right? It's not like, because here's the thing: is like, okay,
well, I was just saying limbo is technically part of hell.
Well, that's the point, right? So the point here is if hell, if limbo is part of hell, then what's stopping these people from going to limbo? Like, it doesn't seem like, it doesn't seem like there's nothing really stopping them from going to limbo in that case. So, so yeah, I don't know what.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That if you are gonna, hold open for limbo and limbo's part of hell, then yeah, that would seem to logically make sense. And I guess in the, it's just, when assessing is this the plausible view. And again, like I try to hold it open to as many views as possible because I just don't think we really know that much. But I did find a thing on the answer to that point that was raised, John. So on the newadvent.org, so it does say the immediate knowledge of God, which the angelic spirits and the souls of the just enjoy in heaven. It is called vision. So this is under a section called beatific vision, and it does have the imprimatur. So it is, proved, Catholic teaching. And I was just wondering, do the Animorphs have an imprimatur? Or...
So wait, I wasn't sure what was the sort of conclusion, because I think.
Well, like, I was just saying the angels will have the beatific vision. I don't know if that's like official church teaching. I mean, it might be, but this is at least approved church teaching. I mean, it makes sense to me. I don't know why they wouldn't, if they're in union with God. Yeah,
it might have just been like Thomas's thoughts that they wouldn't, given that, like, or at least we wouldn't at least know, given that we would think that like God's taking on of a human nature is what sort of bridged the gap between man and God. So like if we don't know if God sort of like also took on an angelic nature, we similarly wouldn't know if like God bridged that gap between angel and God. So I don't know, it might just be sort of a speculation that God would bridge whatever gap might be there so that the angels could enjoy the beatific vision. But I don't know. I also sort of see angels as like Vulcans that would be perfectly content in whatever state God sort of puts them in.
So one question, when it comes to, because there obviously, I think church teaching does teach that there's going to be this schism, maybe not schism, but like this divide between the saved and the damned. Mm-hmm. So would you guys say that division is just the beatific vision itself? So like those that receive beatific vision are saved, those that don't receive it are damned. Would that be where the dividing line is? And anything else is up for speculation. So like limbo or any of that other stuff is just up for speculation at that point. I don't know. What do you guys?
I mean, it makes sense. I mean, if heaven is beholding the beatific vision, big
sorry,
I was like, somebody booted.
It's his channel, okay? He gets the big seat.
Okay, anyways, yeah, that heaven is at least part of heaven is beholding the beatific vision, and then hell is not. So yeah, I mean that to me, and then hell is an eternal punishment. Those to me are like the core teachings, and we can't know, somebody is saved unless they're canonized. I mean, to me, those are kind of the essential teachings. Maybe that excludes annihilationism, but the church hasn't officially declared it, anathemas as far as I know, so it doesn't. But yeah, to me, those are the core ideas in my mind.
So isn't it the case that like, okay, there's almost like 2 points? Well, I know what I want to know is like, at what point in time is a person's judgment made? Is it at the end of time, in which like all the damned shall be judged, or is it like immediately upon death that they're judged? Is there like a specific sort of approach regarding that within church teaching?
Well, I know the particular judgment is going to be immediately when you die. And of course, on my sort of model of that is, I don't know if you guys would agree with the model that I presented. Basically, when you die, like you meet God. Like it doesn't matter if you're saved or not, you're going to meet God regardless.
Mhm.
The difference is that when you meet God, your soul is going to be either in heaven, purgatory, or hell. And whatever determines which state you're in is going to determine your conformity or lack of conformity to God's will, basically.
Right.
So would you guys agree at least with that? At least that makes sense of what the judgment, like, I don't think the judgment is like, okay, like you go into a courtroom or, like
Yeah.
God, okay, you're going to hell. Like, no. I actually think
Yeah.
I think it's just that when you meet God, basically, whatever your conformity to God's will is basically just going to determine what state you're in, and that's basically the punishment, the judgment, so to speak. What's your guys' thoughts on that?
I think that makes sense. Like when you're in the presence of the highest good, but you're not willing union with that good, then being in his presence is going to be tormentful. I think.
Yeah.
In the same way that, like, if you're in the presence of somebody that you've betrayed and you like have this sort of like, and you still don't like, you haven't sort of repented or anything like that, then it's going to be torturous to sort of be in their presence knowing what you've done to them. And I think that, like, similarly, I think even Thomas talks about how, like, the fires of hell are the same fires of purgatory. And within at least the Eastern Orthodox Church, they sort of see that those fires as being God's love, both for the damned and also for those in, well, they don't say purgatory.
Well, it also makes sense of divine simplicity. So if God is simple and if God is an act of love, then his act of love is going to be identical to his act of mercy and his act of wrath.
Right. And
so,
the
like,
difference is going to be in us rather than in God.
Yes, because God's not going to change, basically. What's going to change is our response to God, basically, right?
Right.
And I
would qualify divine simplicity a little bit differently, but that's going to get off topic, and I make a distinction between God's acts and fundamental attributes. But I'm fine with what you said. If we were in a top discussion on that, I might qualify it a little bit differently, but I don't really.
Well, what I mean is that when you're in the presence of God, God's response to you is not going to be different. Like God's response to, like, let's say, Mary versus Hitler or something is not going to be different. The only difference is going to be, I mean, again, I'm not saying that Hitler's in hell, but assuming he is in hell, okay, his response to a saint versus someone like Hitler is going to be the same. What's going to be different is their response back, basically.
Right. Yeah, because God loves and wills the salvation of all, even Hitler. And so the difference in whether or not Hitler is ultimately saved is going to be dependent upon whether he repents or has repented. All right, what are your guys' thoughts on my inhibitory model of hell? You guys each have to, I mean, Caleb, you've got your special name for your hell. Kyle, you need to come up with some sort of special name just for this view. The limbo model.
What do you mean the name?
Oh, just something that people can use to refer to. Yeah, like eventual limbo view of hell or something.
Yeah, like mine would be a limbo, eventual limbo view.
There you go. Yeah. So what do you guys think of the inhibitory model?
Well, I know we've talked about it before, John, so I would say, yeah, I mean, it seems compatible with church teaching. I would just have the concern, like, is God actively perverting creatures in this view? And I'm not saying it is, like, it could be an essentialist kind of connection, or, again, like, it's going to come down to intuitions and such. I don't have, like, I'm not saying it's wrong or whatever. I don't know. I just wonder if it entails, like, God's turning people into irrational animals, and that I would find difficult to find plausible, and maybe that's going too far, but that would be my point.
Yeah, so, like, it seems almost like a moral good to inhibit somebody from performing some sort of sin. And so, like, if somebody's entire will is, like, inclined away from God, it might be good for God to sort of, like, take away their powers and capacities so that they don't ultimately continue to sin. And so I don't know, if somebody ultimately wills against God, then maybe by removing their intellect, that's preventing them from blaspheming or something like that. And so maybe that might be a reason for God to demote somebody down to like an animalistic level. And of course, like the animal is really just a sort of way of thinking about like somebody degenerating into something. Like we could still think that they're fully formed intellect of some sort, but their powers and capacities are limited. It's just that they're a person that exists in a sort of general state of willing evil, and then not being able to not being able to accomplish that evil.
So I can understand the intuition behind that sort of model. So there are obviously some sins that I think God should prevent someone from doing. One example might be torturing others, or like obviously there are some sins that like actually cause harm. But there are some other sins that I'm kind of questioning whether God should prevent them. So like one example is lust, right? So lust is that brings pleasure to people, right? So I'm wondering, on your sort of model, would God also be preventing like someone like doing lustful actions?
I think so, given the same sort of reasoning as like preventing somebody from harming others. So like when somebody commits an act of lust, they're in a sense harming themselves. Now it's not like a like experientially or phenomenological harm that they're experiencing. It's a pleasureful sense, but they're still actively working against their own integrity and also actively working against their own nobility. And so it seems like, well, then that might give God a reason to sort of like inhibit their faculties or powers so that they don't harm themselves any longer or even further than they've already gotten to.
I see, because I'm just wondering, like, because I do imagine that there might be like areas of hell, so to speak. And I'm talking like the lake of fire, basically. And we can talk about that in a minute if you want to, because I think there is a distinction between the intermediate state, which we call hell, versus the lake of fire. But at least applying this to lake of fire, because obviously I don't think you could actually do lustful actions if you're in the intermediate state because you don't have a body, right? But obviously in the lake of fire version of hell, right, the final place of hell,
and they're given
I could imagine I could imagine a scenario in which there's like a place in which those that are like addicted to lust or sex or something go to like perpetually fulfill that desire that they have. So in your model, would you say that like God is preventing them from doing those actions?
I think so. It just sort of makes more sense to me that if God, like the ideal state of the world is not one in which creatures are continually sinning, either against themselves or against God or against others. And it seems like at the end of time, we will sort of reach this sort of ideal state of the world, which would mean that it can't be the case that we have these beings that continue in sin.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense, because I can sort of see how like it just seems weird that sin would exist forever in that sort of way. So I mean, even on my model, I wouldn't say that it would. I think in some senses sin's going to end. It's just whether, I think there's a distinction between whether everybody's going to stop sinning and receive the benefit of vision, or if, there's different ways you look at this. But yeah, I don't know. Dry apologist would. Oh yeah, I think you already had your point. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I was just gonna say.
I'm done.
Well, I wanted to push back one last time regarding like, in the same way that we might say it's immoral for God to annihilate a being out of existence, I kind of see that like it might also be immoral for God to anesthetize somebody out of their conscious experiential existence. And so I think that like maybe if there's a way for God to allow them to continue to exist and to continue to be aware of their existence, without them perpetually sinning or experiencing torment for the rest of eternity, that might be most preferable for God to do in acting in accordance with love towards those creatures. And so that's like why to maybe favor my model rather than your semi-annihilationist model. Caleb.
Yeah, I think like there are points that can be put towards any of the views. I mean, again, I don't think we know for sure, so I think we're all working with proposing maybe a more
Mhm.
merciful view of hell that's more plausible with like moral intuitions and such, and then trying to work out what that might look like is what I see us trying to do, and I think
Mhm.
that's good.
Yeah.
All right, so the next thing is the distinction between hell and the lake of fire.
Right.
So obviously, hell is the intermediate state when you're in the presence of God and you reject God, whereas the lake of fire is when you're actually given a body and you're still in that sort of state where you reject God and you want to sin or something. So what do you guys think is hell on that sort? Like, but what is a lake of fire? Like, I mean, in that case, it seems like it would be a physical place, even if a physical place, not in the sense of like this is like this area specifically is where they're gonna go, but rather they're sort of outside God's kingdom, so to speak, and so they sort of live out their lives, their eternal lives, separated from God's kingdom. I don't know what's your guys' views on that sort of aspect of hell, because that is the final destination of the damned. So I'm wondering.
Yeah. Well, I think the lake of fire is an image in the Bible, Chris, that is drawn up perhaps upon from like Gehenna. If there was like, I guess there's some debate about this, but if it was like a fiery pit, near Jerusalem or in that area, that it makes sense they would use the fire imagery. And I did find that going back to saying like that God is the fire and such, of course that's found in different places throughout the Bible. And Pope Benedict in the document Spe Salvi does refer to some theologians advocating that view, so it does have at least some recent traditional considerations. So yeah, I mean, I just look at it as an image. I don't take it as like a literal lake of fire. And the book of Revelation, of course, is full of imagery. I mean, those references in Revelation, I think, are perhaps the most difficult for a view of hell to reconcile with, but the book of Revelation itself is very symbolic. And I mean, Jesus's references to like the eternal fire goes back to Isaiah 66, which I think is a symbolic passage about burning bodies and such. So I think we should treat these things as pretty metaphorical in nature.
I was just say, like, for my model of hell, I don't have any like clear distinction between the lake of fire and the
And
other,
Hades, yeah,
and the like middle state. So I figure like this model could be in the lake of fire, and then there's something else in between, or vice versa, or it's both, or something. I don't know.
yeah. For me, I mean, there's one view that I think would be also acceptable for a Catholic to hold to, which is that the lake of fire is not it's like a sort of it's a state of mind, so to speak, and so like the people that are damned are going to willfully want to separate themselves both from God and the saints, so they live outside of heaven in that sort of way, and they sort of like live out their lives perpetually in sin, right? Now, of course, on my sort of model, I do think that on my eventual limbo view, they will get better, but just not in a supernatural sense, like the
Right.
beatific vision. So, do you guys think that that is an acceptable view within Catholicism? I know Sue-Ann thinks that it is. But what about you guys?
You're
Yeah,
talking about if things get better, like
for the damned.
I don't
Yeah,
see
like
it like
even
condemned, but I don't
well,
see it condemned, so I don't see why it wouldn't be acceptable.
because it's like they're still in hell. It's just not like it's basically like the best it can get for hell, which is limbo, basically. Whatever that looks like. I mean, one way it could look like, I think, in one sense, the way it can look like is it's sort of like think of it like a utopia, but without supernatural elements to it. So it's
Right.
all natural elements, but there's still some supernatural elements to hell. Or yeah, not super. Sorry, it's all natural, not supernatural.
Right. Yeah.
That's what I meant. Sorry,
Yeah.
but
I do like it because it sort of like gets at the restorational or the restorationist sort of like understanding of punishment, and be able to apply that to the concept of hell without um, like going all the way to universalism. So like somebody might be a universalist and make the case that like, oh, retributive justice is like not real justice, and you can be like, yeah, I agree. Like here's a restorative sort of model of justice that takes place.
Yeah, and I do think the restorative models are definitely compatible with Catholic doctrine as well. So, yeah.
Yeah.
But
Well, I do think I don't know. There is a clear sense of like hell being a place of punishment, and I don't know. Like, I guess you could refer to a restorative model of justice as being a type of punishment, but there is generally it seems like restoration is just due to like some sort of weakness or imperfection of some sort that you had beforehand, without really getting at the sort of I don't know. Maybe that's just a sort of assumption though on my part that punishment requires retribution of some sort.
And also I think another thing when it comes to the restorationist sort of view is the beatific vision is something beyond, I would argue, beyond a restoration. So it's not just like, you know,
Right. That makes
it's
sense.
actually like it's actually because it's not like we were, because I mean think about it. I mean it's not like we're created with a full understanding of, or it's not like we're created with theosis automatically and then we lost it at the fall.
Right.
And we're trying to get back to that. I actually think that the restoration, I think this is compatible with the restorationist view. And what the beatific vision does is the beatific vision actually goes beyond just restoration. It actually gives you theosis and stuff like that. But
yeah, I like that. Because like understanding like heaven as a supernatural grace that's given, but God is still perfectly perfectly just and perfectly merciful towards even the damned, as well as towards those in heaven as well. All right. Do you have anything else you want to sort of go over before wrapping up? We can maybe take some questions, I guess.
Yeah, we'll take some questions before. I'll give it like few minutes. If anyone wants to ask any questions.
Roberto had some questions for me during my presentation.
Okay, I'm just gonna go. Oh, there's not that many stuff. Why not just okay? Well,
Okay.
marriage is covenant, so yeah. Yeah, same thing.
I guess there's a relevant difference between a marriage and a just general covenant, in that like marriages are typically ordered towards procreation.
Yeah, well, what I meant by marriage is in a very, very, very broad sense of the term, not in the procreation sense of the term.
Sure.
So.
And I guess like covenants can be a bit too legal in that like I'm making a covenant with you that you're going to work for me and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like a marriage is a type of commitment or a covenant that's done in love. Okay, what's the oldest reference to something like the inhibitory model? So I'm not really well read on like the actual history to the hell debate, but I think that it at least stems from these assumptions or understandings of justice from Aristotle, where you have this sort of understanding of virtue and vice as being that which you practice, that which you become. So a just man is someone who practices the virtues of justice, and a vicious man is somebody who practices the vices or things like that. And so I think it's sort of drawing from that, which I think is very classical and definitely very much in line with what probably most of the church fathers would have been considering, given that they have a strong affinity towards Aristotle. So I think that it is going to be very consistent with the intuitions and positions of the early church fathers, but I don't have any like particular references. So like, oh, here it is, written by Saint Gregory of Nyssa or anything like that. Why assume retributive justice in light of the cross? Romans 5:8.
I don't think any of our models assumed retribution, as far as I'm concerned. I know mine doesn't, but
I'd mentioned in that it was like hell is a place of justice. The damned are in hell due to their
see.
actions. But I think that like so Romans 5:8, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I don't know. Like I don't see like God is acting beyond that which we are like or going beyond what we are properly due through the crucifixion. So I don't know. Why assume retributive justice? Yeah, I'll have to think about it. Thank you, though, Roberto. Do you have autonomy once you are saved? Is that bad? So yeah. I brought up how a reason to think universalism is false is because it inhibits actual autonomy over the place of a person's soul. And then he's raising the point, but once somebody's saved, then can they like actually still use that? And I think it's a utilization of a person's autonomy to choose their eternal resting place. So it is still in autonomy, in accordance with autonomy for the elect, those that are in heaven with God, to remain with God for the rest of eternity, even though they can't go back. That's not like they still have their autonomy because they acted in accordance with their decision.
well, another thing is I should add here is the Beatific Vision. Once you get it, that's it. You're like you're good. Well,
Yeah.
okay. One way to think about this is once you understand, once you see what God really is, there's really no reason to reject him. So that's just the bottom line at the end of the day.
Right,
But
but then there's the universalist sort of concern. Well, why doesn't God just like show everyone who he is? That way they're always going to be in union with him. And I think that the proper response to that is to say that that's going to violate their consent in some sort of way. And I think it has to be the person willing to be shown who God is fully before God can do so.
Here's another analogy I like to use for that is it's kind of like, okay, let's say you're in purgatory and you're trying to like, in that case, you're trying to purify, God's trying to purify you. It's kind of like Beauty and the Beast, so to speak, where like at first it just seems very difficult, but eventually you get to a point where it's like, okay, I fully accept God, and that's where you get the Beatific Vision, and that and in that sense your will is fully in line with God's nature. But it is a hard process just because of, I think the reason why that is the case is because our love for God is very, very limited, basically, right? Or at least not. It's imperfect, and so it takes time for our love for God to become perfected as time moves along, right? And so it is sort of like Beauty and the Beast in that sort of way, where at first it seems very difficult to fall in love with a beast, so to speak. Again, it's just an analogy, but yeah. I don't know. Do you have any extra thoughts on that sort of aspect, or not really? Okay. Okay. Well, I guess that's it for questions. So
it's all good though. Yeah, I really appreciated this, like getting to sort of lay out 3 models that have commonalities for sure, but I think that like a lot of what's sort of driving our proposals is a sort of like moral intuitions regarding how people talk about hell is just not really in line with our moral intuitions, and we want to say that God is fully just and fully loving and fully merciful, and so we're trying to sort of make sense of all these things while also trying to stay within the constraints of Catholic teaching and tradition. So yeah, I really appreciate all 3 of our sort of models here.
Kind of again, I feel kind of bad that Suan Sona couldn't join us, but I mean, he was going to present a whole case against universalism, so I don't know if that would have gone really interesting, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This is a good stream, and hopefully, it's helpful to people in thinking about this. And if they have other questions or whatever, they can always leave them on my channel or Twitter or wherever.
Yep, and I will be doing videos on at least my model of sin, or my model of salvation, I should say. But yeah, so just check that out when it comes out. But anyways, thank you guys for watching.